Hello again. Now that your bellies are pleasantly full, I am excited and honored, proud to present Dr. Katie Cangany, a history scholar and a faithful steward of her ancestors' legacy. She will be speaking on keeping the Lord's banner from trailing in the dust, talking about the early years of OLCCP. If you saw her bio, she has a PhD in history and taught at University of Notre Dame, and of course is the tri-great granddaughter of our church founders, Colin and Carolyn Campbell. So thank you very much, Dr. Cangany.
Thank you. Can you all hear me in the back? Good. I am delighted and honored to be with you this afternoon to help you celebrate a tremendous milestone. One of the things that is remarkable about this congregation is your enduring pride in the church's history. So what I thought I would do today is talk about the congregation's origin story and how and why the Orchard Lake Chapel, that first iteration of OLCCP, came into being. And when I was here last December, we talked about Caroline Lynn and Colin Campbell's origins, each growing up in Scotland in the early years of the 19th century, each trying on different, increasingly evangelical denominations of Protestantism before settling individually on the disciples of Christ. So I want to say, my pointer works here. Okay. All right, Joe, I may have to ask you to advance the slides if you don't mind. One moment. All right, this is what 150 years is all about, right? It's the delay. Okay. So we'll go ahead and talk about the disciples of Christ for a minute, because this denomination is going to be useful for our purposes today. So the disciples of Christ had been formed in 1832 during the Second Great Awakening. So this is a period of intense religious revivalism that spanned both sides of the Atlantic Ocean in the early 19th century. So both Caroline Lynn and Colin Campbell independently got swept up in that religious fervor, as did many young people around them. So, unlike the established Presbyterian church, the disciples were not Calvinists. They did not believe in predestination. They did not believe in unconditional election. In other words, human beings had free will over their spiritual destinations. So disciples wanted to restore Christianity to what they saw as its original pure form, the form that the 12 apostles supposedly practiced. So by returning to this original form, stripping away all those later false practices and distractions, disciples could not only restore Christianity to its true shape, but also, and this is the part that's important for our purposes, hasten the second coming of Christ. Because the second coming, in 19th century evangelicals' belief, was dependent on a perfected world. And that world would be perfected by the faithful. All this perfection would then catalyze Christ's return, right? So no pressure. So evangelicals in this period were reformists, becoming active members of various progressive political and social causes to fulfill their religious obligations, to improve the world, and then usher in Christ's return. So this set of religious beliefs, this religious obligations, they would inform everything the Campbells did, from the social causes they supported, to the institutions that they helped establish, to the way that they conducted their everyday lives. Everything was about serving others to improve the world. Well, last time we were together, there we go. Last time we were together, thank you, Joe, we talked about the social causes that the Campbells supported. Abolition, that means ending slavery. Women's suffrage, that means voting rights for women. Vocational education for working class children and teens, and foster families for orphans. And Colin and Caroline Campbell shared most of their social causes, but Colin, being a prominent businessman, got more kudos for them. So as one relative put it, quote, "Mr. Campbell is an honest, kind-hearted, and generous to a fault. He made money fast and gave it away faster. He has a wealth of heart that no man can give or take away, and he's given half his time and more than half his earnings to the needy and lonely-hearted. A kind of private banker all the while, he took care of widows and orphans and broken-down people by the score." These sentiments were also true of his wife. Less than 2 years into their marriage, now with an infant John, the Campbells determined to immigrate to the United States, and not just the family of 3. Also on the journey were Caroline's parents, all but one of her siblings, plus a sister-in-law and a nephew. And Colin paid for the fares of almost the entire group, which tells us not only about his bank account and his generosity, but also about his charisma, because family sources make plain that he was the one who convinced all of them to immigrate. Well, settling out from Glasgow, the group had planned to go on to Illinois to take up farming. Now, to us, this seems nonsensical. They had among them no farming experience. These were urban people. But that probably explains the appeal. They were eager to own considerable land and live off it self-sufficiently. And undoubtedly, they were drawn to the idea of farming being honest work, laboring for God, community, and self in that order. But when they arrived in August 1842 for a brief layover in Detroit, they abandoned their original plan. Primary sources give us 2 different explanations for what happened. So the newspaper accounts say that the boat docked at Detroit at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the captain would not go on to Illinois until more passengers could be had. As the stopover lengthened, Colin and his brother-in-law, Thomas Lynn, disembarked and roamed the streets until dawn. News spread that Scottish immigrants were stranded, so the local Scots community converged on the waterfront and urged the party to make Detroit its permanent home. Isn't that lovely? The local Scots community. Okay, hold that in your minds for a minute because we will come back to that. So that's the newspaper coverage. But family recollections give a different explanation. With a baby in arms, and apparently now camped out on a wharf overnight while her husband and brother-in-law gallivanted about town, it was Caroline Campbell who put her foot down and said, "We are not going any farther." So whatever the reason, the Campbells and the Lynns settled in Detroit, and in the early years, they lived together, they worked together, they worshiped together, and they never gave up on their dream of farming. In the early years, the Campbells owned an enormous vacant lot in Detroit on Woodward Avenue at Selden Street. So this is just north of where Orchestra Hall is now in Midtown. Selden Street was known as Campbell Street, and the Campbells' vacant lot stretched from Woodward all the way west to Cass, and from Selden all the way north to Alexandrine. So they had a full city block. And on the city block, they grew vegetables, fruits, and flowers. And Caroline's father, William Lynn, who lived with the Campbells, grew pink, red, and yellow tulips that were so spectacular, people came from far and wide to see them. Well, the lot provided fresh air and breathing room from the grime and the crowding of the city, but because it was within city limits and because there were no structures on it, the lot, of course, could not be a total escape. So in 1856, 14 years after arriving in Michigan, the Campbells purchased the island in the middle of Orchard Lake. And back then it was simply known as Orchard Island. They bought it for $3,050, and they acquired it through their Scottish network, and that network stretched all the way back to Glasgow. So when I was here last year, we talked about Colin Campbell's tumultuous formative years, which were marked by a series of losses. His father, John Campbell, had been a weaver, and he was married previously. He had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. He married Jessie Garnick in November 1804, and 6.5 years later, their first and only child, Colin, came along, when his mother was purportedly 50 years old. John Campbell died when Colin was 4, so Colin was sent to Edinburgh's Canongate Kirk to be trained up for the ministry by his uncle, the Reverend Henry Garnick. But Garnick died when Colin was 8, and that marked the end of the boy's formal education. He returned home to Glasgow and at age 14 got involved in the paper and stationery business. At 19, he was the bookkeeper at a bottling or brewing house. And then when he was 20 in 1831, his mother died. The following year, he owned a grocery store just outside of Glasgow, but now with both parents gone, Colin moved into a suite of rooms that he called Bachelor's Hall with 3 roommates. And these friends, John Thompson, James Jack, and James Dow Shearer, would shape the rest of Colin Campbell's life, including his decision to purchase the island. So let's start with roommates number 1 and 2, and I warn you, this network gets convoluted. They're all connected to each other multiple times over. Most of those connections go through one roommate, and that is John Thompson. So it's convoluted, but that's the point. Okay, so John Thompson and his siblings grew up near Paisley, that was Caroline Lynn's hometown, and they immigrated from Glasgow in 1841, the year before Colin and Caroline immigrated. And the Thompsons settled on a farm in Adrian, Michigan. Around the second time, the second roommate, James Jack, also left Scotland, and he settled in Detroit. So these 2 departures might explain Colin Campbell's sudden desire to immigrate to the United States and to settle in Michigan. Well, soon after the Campbells arrived in 1842, John Thompson, James Jack, and Colin Campbell all went into business together, forming a dry goods store on Jefferson Avenue called Campbell and Jack. So now, 3 of the 4 former roommates were business partners. Then the ties between the Thompsons and James Jack were further cemented the following year in 1843, when John Thompson's sister, Catherine, married James Jack. So now 2 of the 4 former roommates are brothers-in-law. Well, Campbell and Jack got their merchandise in New York City at a Scottish firm called Forrest and Drummond. And if you know the Campbell's son Forrest, this is where his name comes from. So Colin Campbell traveled to New York twice a year to choose his stock. And in addition to selling general dry goods, Forrest and Drummond were also the official American importers of J&P Coats thread, which was made in Paisley, Scotland. So the J&P of J&P Coats were James and Peter, and their younger brother Andrew Coats was the New York distributor to Forrest and Drummond. So if they hadn't all known each other in Scotland, this New York business connection is probably how James Jack, the Thompsons, and the Campbells got to know the Coates family. Those New York ties might account for why, when Campbell and Jack disbanded in 1847, James Jack went into business with another Coates brother, John Coates, who came to Detroit. John Coates further cemented his ties to that Michigan-Scottish network the same way James Jack had, by marrying into the Thompson family. John Coates married Mary Thompson, John and Catherine's sister. Well, despite being brothers-in-law, Jack and Coates was a short-lived enterprise, closing in 1851, the same year John Coates purchased Apple Island. And James Jack then went to Green Lake with his family, and he died about 3 years later. Okay, so now we can see how Colin Campbell and Caroline Lynn probably learned about Apple Island and bought it from John Coates in 1856 through this network, which centered on John Thompson. And as a result of the purchase and visits to the island, those ties between the West Bloomfield Scottish community and the Detroit Scottish community strengthened. Why? Because John Thompson had another sister, Jane Thompson. And in 1857, the year after the Campbells bought the island, Jane Thompson married a Scottish farmer who lived in West Bloomfield, and his name was William Dow. William Dow had been the second owner of Apple Island, the one who sold it to John Coates, who then sold it to the Campbells. I know, it's so convoluted. It's so convoluted. Yeah, it's all John Thompson and his sisters. Okay, there's one little coda here before we move on. Remember James Jack, the first business partner, the one who went to Green Lake? Okay, he dies in 1854. His widow, Catherine Thompson Jack, remarried, and her second husband was Peter Dow. That's her brother-in-law by marriage. So her sister, James Thompson, had married William Dow, and she married William's brother, Peter. So now 2 Thompson sisters married 2 Dow brothers. Okay, I know, it's ridiculous. Okay, now we come to the third roommate, the half-nephew, James Dow Shearer, and he was known as Dow, which is probably a name of significance. So there's probably a connection through marriage between the Campbells and the Dows that preceded both families coming to Michigan, but that remains to be determined. Okay, so now we know how Caroline and Colin Campbell learned about Apple Island, how they came to buy it in 1856. And it's worth emphasizing that both of their names were on the mortgage. That was highly unusual for this time. Women's names were very rarely on legal documents. But remember that Colin Campbell was an advocate of women's rights, including property rights, even more so than his wife was, and it would have been important to him for her name to be on the mortgage also. In the 1850s, the journey from Detroit to Orchard Lake would have been arduous. Wagons loaded with belongings would have trundled out of the city on the Saginaw Trail, which in those days was a plank road. And once in Pontiac, they picked up Orchard Lake Road and then Commerce Road. They unloaded on the bluffs overlooking the lake off of Commerce there, and they carried everything down to the water by hand. And then everything was then taken across by scow. So the journey by wagon would have been 5 hours long. Later, it became more common for them to go by train to Pontiac, and that was about an hour's journey, which left a 5-mile drive by wagon from Pontiac to the shore. Well, mostly the island was a vacation destination, although there was plenty of work to be done, clearing roads, weeding gardens, drawing water, building and maintaining structures. And there also was what one archaeologist has called hobby farming. Initially, the Campbells did much of this work themselves, much as they had done on the lot, and later they hired a farmer who expanded the enterprise. In 1879, there were 10 acres under cultivation, yielding 5 tons of hay, 25 bushels of corn, 12 bushels of wheat, and 20 bushels of potatoes, along with 50 apple trees, 8 peach trees, and a grape arbor. And they had livestock too, 2 horses, 2 milk cows that produced 160 pounds of butter, 9 pigs, 95 domesticated fowl, which produced some 200 eggs. They made hardly any money from this venture. After the wages of the farmer were deducted, they were left with about $100. That's about what a day laborer would have made in a month. In the center of the island, perched on the high ground, was the Campbells' house, a modest, red-roofed, white-clapboard structure, undoubtedly the first structure on the island, and it had been started in 1847 by William Dow. And in its original form, it was a 5-room cottage, 2 rooms on one side, 3 on the other, divided by a central hallway. At some point after 1847, a large extension was added out the back, and that comprised a large dining room and kitchen. When the Campbells bought the island in 1856, the house came at least partially furnished with fine mahogany furniture brought in by John Coates. So you can imagine how difficult it would have been lugging horsehair sofas, rocking chairs, even 2 pianos, all the way down the steep embankment from Commerce Road, across the lake, and then up from the dock to the house. So once the furniture was in, it stayed there until the house was broken up in 1940. So this modest, unassuming house held the origins of OLCCP. Just as in their house in Detroit, in their island home, the Campbells had morning worship each day in the front parlor, and that practice began in 1856. But the only sources that we have about this daily ritual come from the Campbells' granddaughter, Carrie Harvey, after Colin Campbell had died. So you'll note in this passage that we're going to read together that Colin is conspicuously absent. Carrie Harvey remembered, quote, "As we filed into the room, every other entrant took both a Bible and a hymn book. There was a rivalry among us as to who should have the choice seats on the sofa. From there, one had a fine view of the garden, fields beyond, the lake, and the opposite shore, and often one would have much preferred to be nearer the scenes than in Grandma Campbell's parlor. When Grandma Campbell took her seat in the large mahogany rocker, it was time for worship to begin. We each read a verse beginning with a psalm and then a chapter in the New Testament. Counting from the person who read the first verse, it was easy to count up and to study the verse which should come to us, as none of us were facile readers. Sometimes it happened that someone read 2 verses and giggles followed. If any attempted to skip a verse, Grandma Campbell clearly recited the omitted verse with decided emphasis. The Bible reading was followed by prayer. All kneeled by their chairs. If there were no distinguished guests, either Grandma Campbell or Mama prayed. The prayer was followed by singing an old familiar hymn to an old familiar tune, usually a long meter, and the hymn singing dragged on for some time. The memories of these simple, wholehearted services helped many who later wandered away from home influence. Well, in those early days, the Campbells traveled back and forth from the island to Detroit for Sunday services, first in the home of Thomas Hawley, who was the founder of the Disciple Movement in Detroit, and eventually in the movement's first established church, the Central Christian Church, which is now Central Woodward Christian Church in Troy. On those Sunday mornings when they couldn't get back into the city, particularly when they had lots of company, they gathered together for an expanded morning worship service in their island home. And on Sunday evenings, the Campbells also had an evensong service on the front porch just after dinner. The family would gather on the front steps facing the lake as the sun was setting for a hymn sing. And instead of the reserved, solemn hymns of the morning, evensong featured the jubilant, gospel-like hymns of the Second Great Awakening, the kinds of things that they would sing at church revivals and camp meetings. So this Sunday tradition, from the formal to the euphoric, mirrors the evolution of the Campbells' own religious practices. And that evensong tradition continued each summer Sunday until Caroline Campbell's death in 1900. Well, in addition to being a vacation home for the Campbells, the island also served as a respite for extended family and friends, and they too participated in worship services. And we know this because among the objects that were recovered during the archaeological digs done on the island a few years ago were 32 communion cups. 32. Okay, so where are you going to put up so many extra guests? Well, in the early days, when there were no other structures on the island, everybody either stayed in the Campbell house and they slept on mattresses on the floor, or they pitched tents in the meadow. Over time, more cottages went up that could absorb the influx. So at its height, the island boasted almost a dozen houses owned by the Campbells' children and family friends, and these ranged from the substantial, large homes of Forrest Campbell to the less permanent canvas-side structures like the Devendorfs had. But there was one guest who had a dedicated bedroom in the Campbell house at all times, and that was Professor Charles Lewis Lose, a professor of ancient languages and later the president of what's now Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. Lose was distinctive looking, tall, patrician with an abundant head of white hair, and he and the Campbells had met at a church convention in the late 1840s or early 50s, and soon afterward they were inseparable. From 1858 to 1911, that's 53 years, Lose summered on the island with the Campbells every year except 2, so 51 out of 53 years. This guest of honor had his own bedroom in the Campbell house right off the front parlor, which you can see there with the red arrow, and it was nicknamed the Prophet's Chamber. As the year-round community at Orchard Lake continued to grow and the Campbell clan continued to expand, it became increasingly less practical for everyone to gather in the front parlor or to hop the train back to Detroit. So in 1871, Colin and Caroline Campbell put plans in motion to build a church on the mainland, this church. The Campbells' daughter, Tina, recorded, quote, "My parents felt that it was their duty to provide a place of public worship, hence this chapel. I know my father was as interested in it as my mother, and yet it always seems my mother's chapel, perhaps because she was here so many years after his death. She had been in the habit of driving into Detroit to attend church services whenever it was possible, but that did not satisfy her because she could not take all the islanders with her, and she greatly desired for them and her friends and neighbors on the shore the same privileges that she enjoyed." The building of the chapel was in every way a community endeavor. It started with Peter Dow, whose wife Catherine was formerly married to Colin Campbell's first partner, James Jack. Peter Dow gave an acre of lake frontage for the project. And the Campbells' future son-in-law, the noted architect Henry T. Brush, he drew up the blueprints. And then the cornerstone was laid in 1871. Now, it's easy to imagine that the community expected a pretty straightforward process from cornerstone to opening, but it turned out to be almost 3 very hard years. The financial panic of 1873 cast everyone's financial security in doubt. Starting as a stock market crash in Europe, the run soon spread to American railroad companies and financial institutions. More than 100 U.S. banks failed. All this was happening while the community was trying to fundraise to finish the chapel. The stress must have been enormous, and in the end, it took everyone working together for 3 years to pull it off. Caroline Campbell grew and sold several varieties of grapes from the island to raise funds. 3 year-round women, Mrs. Dickey, Mrs. Greer, and Mrs. Cuthbertson, each gave $100. William Williams, who was visiting the Campbells from Wales, gave the communion table. Annie Ellis gave the communion service. Jessie Blackie Lynn gave the large Bible, which was used in this morning's service. Mrs. Seeley from New York gave the Bible cushion. Caroline Campbell's mother, Jean Ralston Lynn, gave the communion tablecloths, which she hemmed by hand. The Campbell's daughter, Jeannie, and her architect husband gave the stained glass window that's now in the columbarium. The pulpit and the melodeon came from the Campbells' Detroit church, and the Campbells paid for a minister while they were financially able to do so, and when they weren't, many other ministers gave of their time freely to sustain the congregation, to, as Caroline Campbell used to say, keep the Lord's banner from trailing in the dust. At long last, on July 18, 1874, the church was complete and the dedication ceremony was at hand. Perhaps 50 guests were in attendance, including Michigan Governor John J. Bagley. Charles Lewis Lose was tapped to give the dedication. His 19-year-old daughter Louise, who you see on the left there, came with him, and the Campbell's son John was smitten. The two would marry in 1881, binding their families even closer. Owing to the formality of the occasion, many of the Campbells' guests upgraded their usual sleeping arrangements, foregoing the tents and shakedowns of the island for finer accommodations in Orchard Lake's 2 hotels, one where the Orchard Lake Museum now sits and the other on the grounds of the Polish Seminary. So to get the dedication service going, they traveled by boat. The Campbells' younger son, Forrest, acted as Commodore, piloting a fleet of vessels from the island to pick up hotel guests and then ferry them to the chapel. His younger sister, Tina, later recorded that Forrest sailed this route every Sunday for 50 years, but she noted he always made sure to bring the minister by rowboat, owing to the uncertainty, as she put it, of a sailboat's reaching a definite place at a definite time. But the Saturday of the 1874 dedication, Forrest's transportation plan went awry. Forrest and Tina's niece, Carrie Harvey, who was then just 6.5 years old, later recorded her memories of the day, and she began by describing Forrest's lead vessel. She writes, "The outstanding island boat was named the Caroline, a modified bateau, flat-bottomed, built high out of the water at both ends. It was propelled by 4 heavy, large, straight ash oars. But for the church dedication, Uncle Forrest turned her from a rowboat into a sailboat, putting in a centerboard and a mast through the front seat. But the boat was too long for the rigging. Dedication morning, Forrest first collected the islanders, and they were landed safely on the shore. But their safe landing was lucky, as there was a stiff breeze cutting diagonally across the bay. And my sister Jessie and I both lost our leghorn hats adorned with natural ostrich feathers. One was found later that summer, the other several years later." After landing the islanders, Forrest sailed to the big hotel, now part of Orchard Lake Schools, for the guests. And among these was Mrs. Seeley, who had given the Bible cushion, arrayed in a gorgeous blue satin dress, and her son Percy. As the boat entered the bay between Cedar Island and Dow Point, a breeze struck it suddenly, and it capsized. With the wind, it drifted on its side to the point, where the people climbed out and walked along the shore to the church, led by Mrs. Seeley, whose beautiful dress was destroyed. The whole episode was looked upon as a huge joke, as a first baptism. The boat did many years of good service for the island, but Grandpa Colin Campbell was adamant against the sail, and it never was used again as a sailboat. Well, at the dedication ceremony on July 18th, a moment of great personal and spiritual significance, Colin Campbell was also under significant stress. A month to the day after that ceremony, on August 18th, 1874, Colin Campbell lost his business, another victim, a protracted victim of the Panic of 1873. He should have been entering retirement, but instead he was starting over. Colin came straight to the island to break the news to Caroline. "Well, Mother," he told her, "I'm 63 years old and I have 63 cents in my pocket." Their daughter Tina recalled, "Mother said to him, 'Well, Colin, we don't have to come down, for we never held ourselves up.'" It was a beautiful moonlit night, Tina recalled, and we were sitting on the front porch, a number of us, and my sister Jeannie, who was very ill, was propped up with pillows in the large parlor rocking chair. When Father unexpectedly joined us on the porch, he told of his loss, and Jeannie impulsively rose and threw her arms around his neck and held his head on her shoulder, kissed him many times, and cried, "Oh, Pa, Pa, it doesn't matter what you have lost if we are all just left to one another." I can see the odd group sitting in the moonlight as if it were today, and a month from that day, on September 18th, she passed on, dying at age 20 from typhoid fever, 5 months after the birth of her daughter Annie. So do you see the timeline here? On July 18th, the church was finished. On August 18th, the business failed. On September 18th, Jeannie died, and hers was the chapel's first funeral. The loss of Jeannie was devastating to the Campbell family, and sources say Colin in particular never got over the loss. His biographer simply noted, "For a time he was nearly distracted with grief, but shortly his faith and courage triumphed and he rose to the situation, entering the fire insurance business, and for 7 years struggled on and succeeded wonderfully well." What the biographer does not mention is that to pay the debts for the business failure, they sold everything, including their house, all to hang on to the island. And it worked. But even as late as 1878, 22 years after purchasing Apple Island, they still owed half the mortgage. Following their bankruptcy, Colin and Caroline Campbell worked to rebuild, eking out a living, supporting their causes, and getting the Orchard Lake Chapel up and running. No longer able to pay the minister's wages, the Campbells felt great anxiety about keeping the pulpit filled. And again, the community came together to see that it was. Charles Lewis Lose continued to preach 2 or 3 times each summer, fulfilling that obligation to Peter Dow. So did Walter Sanderson, a friend of the Campbells who spent 10 summers on the island. Frank D. Taylor, president of Detroit's YMCA, spoke on many Sundays, and so too did Dr. E.A. Lodge, a physician and friend of Campbell's from Detroit. And Lodge, incidentally, was also Charles Lindbergh's great-grandfather. Lodge eventually relocated from the city to Pine Lake, a move that allowed him to become even more active in the church, which in turn enabled the congregation to expand to winter services, and they were made more comfortable by the stoves that he had paid for to warm the building. And of course, Colin Campbell took an active role in the lake, where he apparently performed full immersion adult baptisms, and also at the pulpit. On a Sunday in the late summer of 1883, Colin was presiding over the communion table when he suffered what would prove a fatal heart attack. Frank Taylor, the YMCA president, came forward to finish the service while Colin was transported back to the island, where he lingered for several days. Dr. E.A. Lodge, the physician who was with Colin at the end, in Tina Campbell's words, "He lovingly closed my father's eyes in his last sleep." After Colin's death, the extended Campbell family continued their commitment to the church in his absence. Grandson Campbell Harvey recalled that the Campbell's daughter Tina always took grandmother Caroline Campbell to church early to set up the communion table and to see that everything was in order. "We too left to be there early before the service began so that I could row someone up to the lily pond to get a large bunch of white water lilies to put on the pulpit under the big Bible. This gave people time to meet each other, the persons coming by horse and rig or boat, and when it was thought that everyone had come, the service began. Mother Jessie Campbell Harvey notably accompanied the singing on the reed organ, to whose pedals her feet would scarcely reach, but she could play all the hymns in the proper key without having to have the music before her." And how about this for a church custom? Campbell Harvey also recorded, "We usually took our dogs with us to church. But one Sunday I had an unusually full boatload. The last I saw of Rex, he was sitting on the shore watching us. But during the church services, a very wet, drippy dog came running into the church, down one aisle to say hello to Mother, across the pulpit and up the other aisle, and then jumped up on the seat beside me. Well, it served me right, and for a very few minutes it did disrupt the service and caused much amusement." After Colin's passing in 1883, Caroline Campbell carried on for another 17 years before dying in May 1900 at age 79. And that too might have marked the end of the church, but the matriarch's passing stirred those left behind to renewed action. Tina Campbell, now living alone in the Campbell house on the island, recalled that Charles Lewis Lose and his daughter Louise, by then her brother John's widow, spent the next 11 summers with her on the lake before his death in 1912. And Tina writes that during this window, Charles Lewis Lose took almost complete charge of the church services, a testament to his determination to see Caroline and Colin's ministry continue even beyond the grave. Tina recorded of this period, quote, "All who have seen Professor Lose here at the church will never forget him as he stood, clasping with both hands the back of one of these chairs, his spare figure all alive and responding to his earnest thoughts, his clear-cut intellectual face with his crown of white hair, touched often with the lilac color of aspiration, falling from the red and blue stained glass window above his head." That picture seems to linger here, a perpetual benediction. Well, after President Lose's death in 1912, his son, Charles Lewis Lose Jr., a high school principal from Dayton, Ohio, he carried on his father's ministry here with great reluctance and a great sense of obligation. In Tina Campbell's words, quote, "He was a very modest man, not a preacher, but a teacher, and he feared to try to fill his father's place. I know no one who labored here at greater personal sacrifice. His father spoke with joy, he from a sense of duty." But Charles Lewis Lose Jr.'s untimely death 5 years later in 1917 left the congregation worrying again about how it would go on. That time of palpable uncertainty was 107 years ago, and here we are. So this congregation has a long history of rising to meet its challenges, and that is something to be very proud of and to honor today. So in closing, as Tina Campbell put it in 1921, and she's riffing here on Isaiah 53:11, "If Colin and Caroline Campbell, their children, friends, and neighbors could but see all of you taking part in these services with reverence and devotion, they would see the travail of their souls and be satisfied. Happy 150th OLCCP, may you long continue." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cangany. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to present Dr. Cangany with 2 of the original nails from the chapel.
Oh my gosh, thank you. This is a wonderful gift. We will treasure those nails. They worked hard for those nails, okay? Oh my gosh. So we have a few minutes. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take a few while we've got a little time. Gina?
Why do they have a boat? Because people from the hotel
What's up with the boat for getting to church from the hotels? Well, so a lot of those people were guests. They would have come in by train, so I don't think they had transportation. And water was the easiest way to get around here 150 years ago. So you're going to go by boat. Not in that boat anymore, but you're going to go by boat. Yeah? Were the Campbells intermarried with the Ward family? No, they were not. But interestingly, and I just learned this last night, the Campbell's son John, who married Louise Lose, he was an accountant for David Ward's estate. And when he died, when John Campbell died in 1901, he was living in the Ward cottage on the island. So there was not a marital connection there, but there certainly was a deep affection between the Campbell and Ward families. Willis Ward wrote a book about his experiences growing up around here. It includes a love letter to Forrest Campbell, John's older brother, or excuse me, John's younger brother. So the Wards and the Campbells had a lot of affection for each other, but did not intermarry to my knowledge. What drives my passion for history? Tina Campbell. Tina Campbell did not marry, and she was the family historian, and she put her efforts into documenting everything. And as a child, I read the things that she left behind and the photographs that she labeled. Label your photographs. That's another tip from Tina. Label your photographs. So she left all these wonderful sources that we get to benefit from. So it's Tina. Mm-hmm. Helen Jane. When did the train start coming? It actually was going in the 1850s. So even in 1856, they could have come by train. Tina is very explicit about the fact that they mostly did not go by train. And I don't know if that was the quantity of stuff they were bringing with them or the expense, I don't know. But rather than take the hour-long train from the city, they came 5 hours by wagon. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Okay, what about the indigenous people? So by the time that Apple Island is put up for sale by the U.S. government, and that happens in 1827, there were no longer native peoples living on the island. The 1807 Treaty of Detroit did away with that, right? They were ceding their lands to the U.S. government. But that's not to say that they didn't still visit periodically, and there are plenty of stories among the first settlers talking about indigenous people traveling to the island, every year, but the numbers dwindling as the years went on. And certainly when the Campbells bought the island in 1856, there was all kinds of evidence of indigenous peoples having lived there. There were circular hollows in the ground that were still filled with dry corn from that time period. And certainly they would come across remains from time to time. So there were many reminders of that earlier chapter. Yes? Oh, one moment. The woman in the yellow.
I had a lovely friend, Dr. Margaret Pugh.
Oh, yes.
If you knew her, she was, I know, a descendant of Kim.
Yes, she was my great aunt. So her sister, Suzanne, was my grandmother. So yes, Margaret Pugh was my great aunt. She was a wonderful lady. She was, I don't know, three, I would think I was 4 maybe when she died, so I didn't know her very well. But yeah, she was remarkable. And a physician, and a practicing physician at a time when there were not many women in medicine.
She, when I used to be organist and director here, she used to come sometimes. She and her husband would sometimes come to church. And they were friends, and so then I'd have them for dinner.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah, carrying on that tradition. Yes.
You said they came by train. Do you know where they would get off the train?
So they would take the train into Pontiac and then go by wagon from Pontiac here. But later, right, in the early 20th century, there was a depot in Orchard Lake. And Gina, you're the one to ask about where the depot was. Yeah. At the end of Seminary Road. Yeah, so not far. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
When the surveyors came through surveying Michigan, the surveyors' comments when they saw the island was, there appears to be an apiculture on it.
Yes, okay, so the surveyors noted, I don't know if it's in the Carpenter survey in 1817. I don't think he made it onto the island, but I think it's the one after that. But there's a note that there were apples on the island. Yes, okay, so this is a little bit of a point of contention because Anishinaabe peoples, so the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes, were not apple cultivators. Apples are a Euro-Asian fruit, right? It's a colonist's fruit. So they're not having known for cultivating apples. They did cultivate haws, which are the apples of the hawthorn tree. And there's some speculation that the word that people say was the indigenous term for Apple Island, Mina Sogorning, which is, it's not right, that's not it. But the first part of that, Minensag, is close to the word for hawthorn apples. So my speculation is those are probably the kinds of apples that we're talking about and not Eurasian apples, but it's possible. We know that the Iroquois farmed Eurasian apples, so it's not outside the realm of possibility, but I think probably the more likely scenario are haws. But Tina Campbell does say that the last of those trees, whatever they were, blew down in the tornado of 1872, I think it is, so they're long gone. They've been gone for a long time. Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy the celebration.